AV systems are living and breathing, and because of that, they need to be maintained and modified over time. Source code and programming is a big part of that. We're going to talk about that on this episode of A State of Control. A State of Control, episode 124. Simple always scales. Welcome to A State of Control, an AVNation podcast that highlights the control programming and automation aspects of the audiovisual industry. I'm your host, Steve Greenblatt. Thanks for joining us today. So unfortunately, we don't have my co-host, my partner, Rich Fregosa with us today, but we do wish him well, and we will see him on the next episode. And we do have two fine guests that I'll introduce in just a minute. What we're going to talk about today is the fact that we have to think about how to keep our source code and our programming modifiable, because we all have to keep systems in the AV industry continue to change, and code has to follow suit. So that's an interesting topic that we have on deck for today. And the people that are going to talk about it are first, Brian Magrogan from Verrex. Welcome back, Brian.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this one. This is a good one to talk about.
We appreciate you being here, and thanks for making the effort. Brian was last with us on episode 118, in case you want to check that out, and he's a regular guest. And we do have another fine guest that we haven't spoken with in quite some time, and that's a failure on my part. He has been with us on episode 96 and some other episodes prior to that. His name is Raj Singh, and he's from USC. Welcome back, Raj.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad that I'm back. I always look forward to the conversation, and especially the subject matter that you brought up this time is near and dear to my heart with regards to coding, programming, making sure that things are done correctly, and best practices when it comes to that. So I'm excited about this.
We're glad to have you, and we'll make sure that you're back without further delay in the future. So, as Raj said, one of the things that we all have to think about is being really good about maintaining our programming. And that's something that is just unavoidable. It's something that one of the things I learned when I first started in this industry is that AV systems really are living and breathing, and there's something that are going to grow and are going to change, and source code needs to follow suit. And that applies to control, but it also applies to other products, whether it's audio DSP or even the setup of some of the products within a system. So keeping good records and keeping track and being able to maintain those items is really critical. So Brian, I'll kick it off with you. Tell me a little bit about why this is a sensitive topic, because I know when it comes to modifying source code, everybody really kind of has a little bit of a twitch. So I hope that's relatable.
It is very relatable. I have to stop myself quite frequently when opening code, and I'm like, this doesn't look the way that I would do it. So, and I'm very lucky. I work on a pretty small team. Everybody codes very similarly, but there are still always certain pieces that somebody does differently that I might not do. The way you prefix signals, the way you work on different things. So it is one of those things where when you're working on your own, you get your total preferences, everything. But I think as you work in a group of an open dialogue all the time, and the ability to say, hey, I don't think this works, and here's why, is very important. And then also being able to take that feedback yourself, whether it be from yourself, where you are programming at 2:00 in the morning, you're like, wow, this was not my best coding ever, and from your team, to make sure that you can do that and do that smoothly. I think another big portion there, you were mentioning kind of longevity and how an AV system is living and breathing, is keeping good notes throughout the entire process, right? Like we all do it. It all happens. I start a project, I'm working on it for a week, and then all of a sudden it gets put on hold and something more pressing comes forward. And I have to step away from that for 2 days, a week, a month. And then I come back and I'm like, where was I? So copious notes, understanding what I was doing, understanding my thought process, lots of commenting, so that, if I were to get hit by a bus, hopefully not, somebody else could step in and understand where I was and what my thought process was, especially when it's out of the ordinary. So it's, I think there's a lot of things to consider there.
Raj, you mentioned standards, and I think that that's really important. And you at USC, you're dealing with many systems, not just one-offs. How does approaching code differ when you're looking in that type of a level and maintaining things and the importance of standards?
Yes, Steve. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at any environment, and especially our higher education academic environment, I mean, we have everything. We have hospitals, stadiums, conference rooms, classrooms, auditoriums, study spaces, right? Anything you can imagine, we have a space. But the one thing that I do want to touch upon that I think Steve, you and Brian talked about is that the world that we live in with AV, it is a world that is a living and breathing because humans are part of it. It's the experience that we provide, right? When you look at in a space, what you see, what you touch, what you hear. And the analogy that I always use of somebody who's a programmer is they're almost the conductor of the whole experience. They're working on making sure that all those different disparate pieces that are there in any environment are very cohesive and talking with each other. And that's where a conductor, when you look at an orchestra, they are driving and telling every part of the system in terms of what to do next, right? So they all speak a common language. So if a conductor is out, another conductor will come in and they're able to read what's in front of them and be able to create the orchestra and whatever the product is that they're looking at, that environment may change. So with that being said, I see a lot of analogies between programming and music, what I'm saying? Because end of the day, it's a common language that everybody speaks, there's code, there's standards that are there in place that are important, where your situation may change, but your experience remains the same across the board. And an experience in any space is, collaboration, communication, being able to, take something and tie it with everything that's there in the system. I mean, when you look at AV has presence not just in the audio video space, but in terms of when you talk about experience, there is lighting, there is the ergonomics of the space, there's the temperature control. And all that is driven based on the source code that's been written into a lot of these systems that are there. So that's where having standards and having an understanding of the human element when it comes to programming is very, very important. And making sure that's consistent, it's recorded. Like for us, as an example, let me give an example, right? So we have multiple auditoriums across our main campus and health science campus. We want that experience to be the same across the board. So in terms of documenting that as standard, where somebody walks in, this motion sensor that's triggering, bringing the screen down, that's one step that's removed for somebody to have to do an extra work. But again, that has to be documented and made sure that that's implemented across the board. The lighting preset going to the right preset to indicate now that we're in presentation mode, where the screens in the front are not getting washed out with the lights on it. Again, that has to be documented and the standard has to be put in place. And a programmer is the one, end of the day, that kind of makes or breaks a lot of that experience. As Brian would know, I mean, programmers are usually the last to show up at a job site, but they have the most amount of pressure in terms of what they need to do. And they have to make sure that everything that's done is done correctly because then they get blamed for it, right? So that's where I feel that that's something that companies are learning, and integrators and education institutions, corporate institutions, they're learning the value of that, and hopefully they can expand upon that. But a lot of that goes back to standards again, and making sure that whatever we're doing is replicatable, not only for the programmer but also from an experience point of view from the users of the space. Whatever we're doing is documented correctly, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. And different types of things we're adopting that are industry standards across the board. So let's say it's not unique to that institution, not unique to that manufacturer. It's an industry standard that anybody else can come in, adapt, change, and do what they need to do at that point.
You made a couple good points there, Raj, which I love, and it's such a flip flop in cases. But like sometimes there are certain clients that want a ton of automation, like your example of walking into the auditorium, screens come down, triggered by occupancy sensor. And it's interesting when those spaces change hands because the next person may not like that at all. So, how deep down the rabbit hole do I go? Do I provide options? Do I provide, different things, or do I hard code that stuff based on the preference of the user at that time? And how far ahead do I think in terms of that, and my development plan for it? So that's a great one. I also love your analogy to the conductor, because I totally agree with you. We have to try to make all these different things work in harmony together that weren't necessarily meant to work together. They weren't meant to talk to one another. They weren't meant to, come together at least from the control standpoint. And so I think that's an amazing analogy. I've never thought of that one before, and I love it.
Brian, elaborate a little bit more on what you're what that looks like in terms of how it's done, for the things that you don't want to hard code. Not everybody may know how to accomplish that.
I mean, there are lots of different scenarios that we do. Typically, we try to give some sort of tech page that'll have those setup options, right, of automatic lighting preset recall, automatic, occupancy-based events. A lot of the times, what we'll find and just use our experience to provide is we know that the shutdown aspect is going to want to happen, right? Whether it be time-based, occupancy-based, based on what's in that particular system and what they've deployed. And so that might be something of, I'm trying to declutter a page. I don't want to give a ton of options. It's just more that has to be written to file, has to be saved in some aspect of the case, or in some cases. So finding those pieces that, from number one, from what the client is telling us that they would like, and number two, from our experience, understanding that they may think that they want this, or they may think that they don't want this, but I'm going to spend the extra 10 minutes putting it in the core, in the base of their code, before we replicate it out to 100 rooms or 200 rooms. And then I'm going to go from there and start there. From a technical aspect, I'm going to write all that information to file so that it's saved through code loads, through reboots, through or power cycles, through power loss. And if possible, I would love to use a configuration utility where I can go to one portal, update a whole bunch of spaces, and then it automatically pulls down overnight. I think a lot of places still, unfortunately, are not there yet. There are a lot of great tools out there to be able to do it. But I still think in a lot of scenarios, Raj was saying we are the last people there. And I do think in a lot of scenarios, unfortunately, we are still, I don't want to say an afterthought, but we're still thought of at the very end of the process. And so being able to find a decision maker and being able to find the right person to get you the ability to put that tool in their environment, i.e. some sort of configuration web portal, it is always a challenge. So writing a file, saving it that way, and keeping the configuration files is generally the first bet.
We're talking a lot up here about the changes that may be user-based. Let's talk a little bit about the changes that may be hardware-based, because that's also a component of this. Raj, is there a way that you can plan ahead to think through perhaps what may be how to plan for future equipment upgrades, or is that something that's really too much of a distance when you're writing your code?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think planning is a key component for us here at USC, and especially planning with all the right stakeholders, internal stakeholders. What I mean by that is our programmers, our engineers. We're usually about 6 months to a year ahead in terms of what we're forecasting and what we're looking to do. And, one of the things, and this is another thing that always, I don't want to say bothers me, but it's one of those things that I think about. Like, the thing is, when programmers do a job really well and really good, like, nobody really knows because everything is working seamlessly. The configuration is done right. It's like they're kind of like the unsung heroes, right, of that. And to Brian's point, I mean, when we're looking at hardware refreshes, we're looking at software changes or hard coding things, right? We stay away from hard coding anything. As an example, let me give an example. So, when we did a touch panel upgrade for all our spaces. So in terms of, we had a page that was there for our tier 1 support team that was more with regards to additional capabilities that they can do, like rebooting certain things. It was behind a password. Now that password, we could have hard coded it, but then people would see it. So we made that dynamic so that can be changed on a weekly or a semester basis. And again, that was planned out and put in place. So that way it can be forecasted out. Same thing if we're doing hardware refresh. If we're doing things like our Zoom room systems upgrade or projector upgrades or touch panel upgrades, what can we do if we're doing 300 rooms? Like, how can we systemize, like make a system of that, pre-configure as much as we can, so that way when we're bringing things on site, things are ready to go. One of the ideas that we look at when we look at forecasting hardware changes and software changes is having pre-production rooms. So spaces where we have everything set up in an environment where not only our faculty and users can use the space and get an experience, but also our programmers and engineers and network architects can look at it and understand how that's going to behave in the environment, what impact it's going to have. And once we get that and we are able to replicate everything and see what are the things that not only work right, but also things that will not work right or can go wrong, and we're prepared for that, and then we push that out across the board. And that's why I think standardization is very, very important, because I always tell people you just need to get it right in one room, one building, and then replicate that across. I mean, based on systems we have right now, whether it's AV over IP or that are programmed using using these control systems that are driving all of them. If it's not standardized and not replicatable, then it's not going to scale out. And my big thing is that you got to keep it simple, because simple always scales. Anything complex is not going to scale at that point. So that's my approach when it comes to, like, when I look at hardware refresh, software refresh, these are some of the best practices that I'm always trying to make sure I'm following. And also engaging with our partners too, like our manufacturers, our vendors, our integrators, our programmers. A lot of these conversations, if we are having ahead of time, there are things like drivers, there are things like different code repositories that we can look at and plan for that, because end of the day, if we're doing something, we almost have blinders on. So bringing in outside folks that can look at a system holistically, but also without any bias, right? So they're evaluating it for what it is. I think there's a huge amount of value in that.
I think one of the other things you touched upon there too, Raj, a little bit is in terms of documentation, and not only documentation for us internally, right, for the AV team, the programming team, but for the end user. I feel like one of the most valuable things we provide in the end, in a lot of cases, is just a little quick guide that's there and for the end user. And ultimately, the goal obviously would be not have to provide anything. It'd be so simple and so intuitive that you don't have to provide a single thing. But I think there are those kind of little nuances in every system where if it's on a laminated quick guide that's right there at the panel or right there at the podium, in an auditorium space where, oh, hey, wait a minute, hold on. Oh, right there in bold, lighting will automatically adjust or screens are automatically coming down. There's not a ghost there, something along those lines. And even I really like your example with how like password protected advanced pages are changed on a semester basis. I hadn't thought about that before. And I think that's really smart. How do you deal with, you've deployed 500 systems for somebody and you have somebody who's pretty integral and now they're gone and you're kind of worried about, can they get back in? Not necessarily that they're going to be malicious, but that information is now out there. So, and that very easily could be addressed in a little bit of documentation of, to enter the advanced settings page here, this pin code is updated, on a random basis or however you want to do, contact this person for that, as long as you're authorized. So I think that's good, because even when you have a professor that comes in, for example, and, they were here at the end of last semester, but now they're starting this semester and they forget that it changes on a semester basis and they're starting to lose their mind. Look at that guide and, oh, it's changed. Oh, okay, I know it's changed to this, whatever the case. So I think those can be very invaluable. Sometimes they're tedious to write and sometimes they're a pain and it's like the last thing you want to do, but it can save you a ton of time in the end.
Raj, I'll come back to you on this. One of the things that we are starting to see more of, which is, I think, a good thing that most of us will agree, is the adoption of mainstream programming practices and tools and platforms and so forth. And some of that is version control tools. Talk a little bit about how the AV industry can benefit from stuff like that.
Yeah, Steve. I mean, as far as, adopting tools that are standard and best practices in the wider technology industry that AV is part of, I'm actually very excited about it. And I'm looking forward to this tremendously, because one of the things that's always been a challenge that I feel with the major manufacturers in AV is that it was very proprietary in terms of the code base, the configuration tools, So it was almost a certain language and a way of thinking that you had to learn. And I always give these people the analogy, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. And that's what it was with AV for the longest time, I feel. And now with industry standards and industry-based tools that we have for coding, for technology, I think it's massive because it allows us to establish a common base across the board. It allows us to make sure that, the language that we're speaking is understandable by everybody. I mean, when you look at popular languages like Python, I mean, kids learn it in school these days, you know what I'm saying? So it's also, I think, for the AV industry in general, having these tool set is a great way to attract talent into the industry as well, too. I mean, it's something that, kids graduating high school, colleges are not seeing it like, oh, it's this like random industry that we have no idea about. We have industry standards, there's cloud practices, there's, programming languages that are now industry standard like Python, C, C Sharp, you know what I'm saying? This is something that everybody understands. And there's value in that because let's say we talked about changes that need to be made, you know what I'm saying? They can be made with a lot of folks. Sorry about that. They can be made with a lot of folks as well, too, in terms of companies and people that are working on things internally as well, too. Let's say our programmers who are not there, most of my team knows how to code Python. They know how to code C Sharp. Knowing languages is one thing, but then talking about tools that are then built around those languages is another thing, too. I mean, there are tools that are there like, GitHub, Atlassian, that have the idea and concepts of good code practices, good data hygiene, checking in, checking out code, peer review, making sure that somebody, if they're making a change that is going to impact the enterprise, it's not pushed out without a review from a senior programmer or senior architect that can take a look at it. So these are best practices that are already established in the industry, and us adopting these best practices, I think it's a value add not only for us, but for our customers as well. And the flip side also that I want to tell you is that the fact that when you look at adopting these programming-based practices and languages has also elevated AV. I mean, one thing that I'm sure you've seen in the industry and for technology, traditionally AV fell under facilities or library. It's now part of IT in most organizations. So that has brought AV and given AV a seat at the table when it comes to major technology decisions that are happening. And that will continue if we keep adopting industry standard practices like programming languages, cloud services that are there, things like AWS, Azure, having code repository that's hosted over there. That way it's redundant. It's not, being gone because somebody quit and they left and now the code is gone with them, right? It's like having these kind of things. I always tell people, and Steve, you and I have talked about this, that, traditional AV has been a very bottom up approach where I have a room, I have a space, I'm going to do something here. Where when you look at IT and you look at like programming or coding on a technology space, a top-down approach. I'll start from the enterprise level and make my way down because that's built for scale. It's built for security. It's built for a lot of different things, especially with what's coming in the next couple of years. I mean, change is going to be a constant year to year. So what can we do that we ride that wave of change rather than being under that change, right?
Right, having to be dragged along with that change, right? How do we get on the forefront of that change and make sure that we're helping set those standards too? So I couldn't agree more, Raj, especially being able to use modern tools like SVN, like Git, like all of those makes things so much easier, right? I can make a tag and know this is my known good release, and we can branch and we can work on something on the side and know that I'm not affecting that main release. It is invaluable. It's so much easier too for a team to be able to develop together and work independently while not having to constantly pass things back and forth and to say, did you remember to sync last night? Are the latest files on your drive? And then all of a sudden, oh yeah, they are. You work for 2 hours and, oh, hold on, those are old files. Like, so it's bit me a couple times.
It has. And one thing also, Brian, with that is that, as you know, I mean, programmers And especially the world of programming and the world of AV, it's a very collaborative world. So having tool set that allows collaboration to happen organically is critical, rather than put a friction in place where somebody has to be like, oh, did you upload something to this drive? And somebody like, well, I don't have access to the drive. How do I upload that, right? Now you're building the system up from the ground up to support that capability. And and Steve and Brian, both of you guys know, I mean, programmers are pulled in so many different directions, and they could be in a different city next week, based on the work that they're doing. So being able to do that from anywhere and being able to enforce those best practices from anywhere is key for us, I think.
Yeah. And I think, too, traditionally, AV programmers have been more closed. Right, and there's been a whole paradigm and mind shift of being more collaborative, right? It's funny because we create the collaborative systems to help people communicate and collaborate, but I think AV programmers have been very protective of their coding and their proprietary info, and we're shifting more towards a collaborative environment of different programmers. And I think that has been a challenge for some of the people that have been around for a long time. But like you said, we can attract newer talent now that's coming out of school that already knows all of this. Now that we're into standards-based languages, they're already ready to go, and there isn't this whole, spin up of things that's required just to understand, like, okay, I got to go to this manufacturer's training to learn their whole environment. I've got to go to this manufacturer's to get certified so I can even have access to their environment. So I think it's good in the end. I think it's very good in the end.
As we wrap up, one of the things that's going to be a sensitive topic that I think we should talk about, and I'll let Brian, you could take a first crack at this, is what happens when you're forced to look at code and say, this really isn't something that we should be maintaining or modifying. How do you have that conversation?
Well, you brace for the sales guy to say, what do you mean? I only sold 40 hours, and you're going to tell him it's going to take, 200 hours to properly do this. That, at least for us internally, becomes a group discussion. And it is, hey, we've been bit by this too many times of, yeah, we should be able to modify this. We should be able to do this. But if X happens, we're dead in the water. So let's invest the time now. Let's do it now. And I think a lot of the times we can actually win that. Not that it's a battle necessarily, but we can actually get the right time and get the right hours for that. But sometimes we lose, and I'm not ashamed to say that when it goes sideways, I'm like, hey, remember us in this email where we said we shouldn't do this? Yeah. So I think finding that time too, right? Just like any product has a life cycle, code has a life cycle, right? This product is good for 5 years, 7 years, whatever the case may be, but this code base is the same thing, right? You hack it together enough and it just becomes unmaintainable. So finding that right time, usually I think it is when we're doing a larger deployment and we have time already built in. We use that as a time with the client to sit down and say, hey, let's look at this again holistically. We've been doing the same thing for 5 years now. Let's take a look at everything and let's say, is this still the right way to move forward? And sometimes they say yes. Or should we look at a redesign? And that sometimes will also make the decision for you, where they want a fresh GUI, they want technologies that we can't provide in the old code base. So, but it is always a very interesting topic when it comes up.
Because unfortunately, what started out being very clean, well-written code can over time really deteriorate. And sometimes that's because some people have maybe done things and taken some shortcuts, but also it's just a matter of changes that compile. So it isn't an uncommon thing. Raj, Brian mentioned software lifecycle. Is that something that you also look at? And do you plan for major overhauls of code?
Yeah, so software lifecycle is something that is, I think, to Brian's point, very important. And there is a there is a synergy when you think about hardware lifecycle and software lifecycle, because in terms of the use case of the space may change, or the users may change, the technology may change. When we do encounter something that has been in use for a long time, and of course not quite up to par in terms of standards and the current life cycle, it's like everything in life. I mean, every failure is an opportunity to educate people, right? So that I view it as an opportunity to educate, whether it's the end user, whether it's the salespeople, whether it's whoever else, that this was an opportunity for, to Brian's point, to make sure that the programming team was brought into the fold ahead of time. So they could have done a full evaluation and made recommendations, and then that way they were setting expectations, level setting everything, both from a client side as well as the integration side. Because I think open communication is important. A lot of times people don't know what they don't know. And I think making sure that, and conversations, when you talk about software lifecycle or control system lifecycle, is multifaceted. It's not just about the GUI in terms of aesthetics of how it looks. It's about functionality. It's about security standards in terms of, you could have something that's 10 years old that's unsecure. And now with everything we're hearing about, there is, points of entry into system that has not been patched for a while. So people may not understand value, but majority of people understand risk. And I think, educating people on risk in terms of control system and making sure software lifecycle they understand, because software, unlike hardware, has a much, much shorter life cycle. And I think that's where people, don't quite see that, especially maybe people in leadership positions. But the analogy I always give people is that we upgrade our phones every year, 2 years, I'm saying, maybe 3. Why would that change with your control system or your software that you're using, right? I mean, people are used to updating their Mac OS or Windows OS every year, or Office or whatever else. I tell them the same analogy applies towards this. With extra capability, you have extra points of failure that need to be patched and addressed. And, when you educate people on these kind of things, most people are very open for change, and they understand that, or at least they can plan for it in their mind and through their fiscal policies, right?
I like that a lot.
Yeah, the security aspect, absolutely. I find it to be an eye opener for people. And I think, honestly, people in the industry, too, don't fully understand that this person doesn't care that this is a switcher. All they care is that it's a way in, right? And making sure, like, one of my routines in the morning, my script that launches all the major manufacturers' websites to their firmware and software pages, so I can see updates, read the release notes, and know, hey, we need to take a look at this, or we need to take a look at that. And I think from the AV industry side, we can be a huge value add with that too, right? Making sure that we're staying ahead of the curve and not waiting for the pen testing report to come back in to say, hey, what's going on here? Why is this like this? So, but I that hits home with me a lot.
Well, good place for us to wrap this one up, and great conversation. I appreciate you both for being part of it. And I think that this would be very enlightening to our audience, and something that we'll, like other shows, will continue to discuss and also have these guests back on. Brian Magrogan from Verrex, thanks for being with us. How can people get in touch with you, Verrex, and keep up with what you're doing?
Thank you very much for having me, Steve. It's always a pleasure. Raj, it was great to meet you. You can find me on, as Uncle Richie would say, especially since Dizzy's not here, at B Magrogan on the interwebs, most social media platforms. And you can learn more about Verrex at Verrex.com and at Verrex on all the social media platforms as well. But fantastic conversation. Thank you guys so much.
Excellent. Thanks for being here. And Raj Singh from USC, how can people get in touch with you and learn more what you're doing at USC?
Thank you, Steve and Brian, for having me on the show. People can reach out to me. We have my email, raj.singh@usc.edu, or on LinkedIn. I mean, if they search for Raj Singh USC, I should show up. And I really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you, Steve, and share ideas with you, Brian. And I look forward to this continued conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. I think, as I said, this is going to be an important topic moving forward, and we touched on some things that I think will be conversation starters for a lot of our audience. So that's a very valuable episode. To learn more about state of control and all the things AVNation, check out avnation.tv. As Rich would always say, that's a great place to find him and find us. Rich is also at Fergoza Design, so if you want to keep in touch with him, and also at rfergoza on X or Twitter. And for me, you could reach me at Steve Greenblatt on most social media platforms. My company, Control Concepts, at controlconcepts.net. And one of the things that we do is we help programmers by building a lot of the building blocks, the utilities and plugins that help to make projects work, whether it's integrating with devices or doing some added functionality. You could check that out at controlconcepts.net. And we'd like to hear from you, so please reach out and let us know what you think about this episode. Keep the conversation going. You can come to avnation.tv or go to the AVNation LinkedIn page and comment. We always post about future current episodes, and want to know about future ideas. So please engage with us there. This episode, if you don't know, if you're listening on audio, you can find the video version on YouTube. If you are watching the video on YouTube, you can also get us on your favorite podcast player. And please check out the supporters of AVNation and show them some love and let them know that you appreciate them as well. And until next time, this has been A State of Control,
the network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
This is Erin Marmoran of EdTech. The world of higher ed AV is growing rapidly. That's why each month we hear from the best and brightest from colleges and universities all over the U.S. Check out EdTech on avnation.tv or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.